everyone, and welcome to the Taste of Tomorrow session. My name is Casey and I'm a part of the Bendigo Tech School team. We're delighted to showcase engaging all ages in STEAM as a part of the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. The Bendigo Tech School is a centre of deep learning that uses leading edge technology, discovery and innovation to solve real world problems. Our aim is to deliver advanced STEAM knowledge and skills the Victorian school students need to flourish in the rapidly changing global economy. We are hosted by La Trobe University Bendigo, and we work in partnership with 14 local secondary schools and local industry and enterprise. Firstly, I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the people and traditional custodians of the land of where we are all gathered today. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here today, also paying my respects to your elders past, present and emerging. We express our gratitude in the sharing of this land, our sorrow for the personal, spiritual and cultural costs of that sharing, and our hope that we may walk forward together in harmony and in the spirit of healing. I will now hand it over to David from the Taste of Tomorrow team.
Hi everybody, my name's David Huxley and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Physics and Chemistry at La Trobe University. I'm a physicist and I'm the MC for today, and we've got a great roster of talent who you can see in the Brady Bunch squares around us. So I'm going to just briefly explain what we're going to do today and then launch into the scenario with the panel. Many of you will have these fantastic boxes that contain stuff that's in them to eat. Don't eat them now. Don't open the boxes now. If you've opened it, it's okay. But if you haven't opened it, they're going to tell you when to open the box and when to eat. And we're also going to run some polls as we go through. So what are we doing today? The panelists, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, and I are going to play a role play, a little bit like Dungeons and Dragons perhaps. And I'm going to explain a scenario, and each of the panelists is going to be a character in that scenario. And we're going to explore different aspects of what it means to grow food to feed the population in a sustainable way. So I'd like to introduce the panel because we're really, really lucky to have such talent here today. We have Kim Plummer, who's an associate professor in the Department of Animal, Plant and Soil Sciences at La Trobe. And I think she's got some fungus in pictures behind her because that's one of her research specialties in the areas. We've got Travis Beddoe, who's a professor in the same Department of Animal, Plant and Soil Sciences. And he's also got a logo behind him of one of his big research projects. He does a lot of work on biosensing and diseases in animals. We've got Jim Radford, who's the Principal Research Fellow in the La Trobe Research Centre for Future Landscapes. And you saw him in the video if you came in a little bit earlier talking about his research. We've got Kim Johnson, who is a Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Animal, Plant and Soil Sciences at La Trobe and the Program Lead. She has been the driving force behind the whole Taste Tomorrow events. Next to her is Susan Macleod, who's a lecturer in dietetics and human nutrition and is also part of the Taste Tomorrow leadership team. You can see Casey from Bendigo Tech School, who introduced us, and Gemily and Lena are tech support for today, making everything run smoothly behind the scenes. So now you know who we all are, I'd like to encourage you to think about questions that you can ask the panel. We've got a big question and answer session after the scenario. The scenario should run for about half an hour, a little bit longer. And we're all very keen to have you guys ask us questions. How do you do that? Well, you type it into the Q&A through Zoom, and we will save them all up, and then I'll present those to the panel and we'll discuss those questions at the end. So please, as you think of any questions, just type them into the Q&A at any time. Also, we encourage you to share your thoughts and anything that is happening on social media. Social media is a really good way for other people to find out what we're going on about and to be able to watch this perhaps later if they weren't able to come here to see it today. So without too much more throat clearing, let's go into the scenario. I would like to imagine that, consider that you are in Queensland and there's been a huge series of storms that have swept in from Southeast Asia. And we've noticed over the last 100 years that these storms seem to be becoming more frequent, more severe, and at unusual times of the year, which is related to global climate change. And after a particularly severe storm, all of the fruit and vegetables in Queensland start to die. All of the plants that are producing the stuff that we see in our supermarkets are slowly not producing them anymore. So horticulture is brought to its knees. Supermarkets are becoming empty. Anastasia Palaszczuk and Scott Morrison are desperately worried, especially because of the marginal seats electorates in Queensland. And they pick up the phone to talk to the well-known expert Kim Plummer, who is being asked to create an emergency task force to be able to find out what is going on. So Kim, you've been put on the spot. You've got ScoMo and Anastasia on conference call. You got to think fast. What do you reckon that's going on?
So the first thing I'd ask, being with my plant doctor hat on, the first thing I would find out is what is exactly going on. When you say the plants are dying, are the whole plants actually dying? Is there any evidence of a disease in the plant? Or are we simply not getting fruit where we thought we should be getting fruit? So we do a bit of investigation work. I ring around and find out how widespread is this? Is it all over? Is it limited to just Queensland? Or indeed, is it all over Australia? How far and wide is this problem? So they are really critical questions for us to understand, to try to find out, well, what's the cause of the problem? And if you don't understand the cause of the problem, you can't find a solution to it. So I would ask the inspectors on the ground, the various people who are, the growers, I'd look for feedback and input on what is exactly happening with all of the different horticulture sectors. We've got the fruit, the vegetables. If there's a whole universal failure of our crops, is it to do with the bees, for example, the pollinators? So am I able to get more information as to what's going on with these problems with the crops?
Absolutely. So the school children are pulled out of school and they're sent into the fields to try and count bees. They're given a pair of tweezers and some running shoes, and it becomes very, very clear that where the storm has hit, the bee populations have been decimated. And in the process of this, it seems that it's related to the failure of the crops in those areas.
Okay, so with the bees, there's a number of reasons why the bees could be in trouble. There are any number of diseases that bees can catch, and potentially if we've got storms coming down from the tropics, there may have come in with that storm some little bugs or indeed some little insects or mite type things that are like little spiders that can attack the bees and cause problems by transmitting diseases, for example, a viral disease. So just like we can have mosquitoes transmit a viral disease, some little mites can transmit the disease as well, and there are some exotic problem mites that can come in, or potentially that wind could blow in various microbes like fungi and bacteria that might be attacking the bees in that region. If it's limited at the moment to where the storm hit, I'd be looking at the problem for the bees and asking my experts in bee diseases to have a look at those, any of the bees that are around, and try and see if there are dead bees present. And if there are dead bees, there will be evidence of what microbes or other little animals that might be attacking the bees and causing a problem.
Alan Jones goes on the radio and says it's very clear that ScoMo has lost the plot. He's getting these Latrobe people to solve our fruit and vegetable problems in Queensland, and they're now talking about bees. We don't eat bees. Why are we paying these academics all this money to sit there and talk about completely the wrong thing? ScoMo picks up the phone and says, Kim, do us a favor. What's the connection between bees and the fruit and veg?
Again, Alan Jones clearly didn't get that conversation with his parents about the birds and the bees as a child. But if he did, maybe he didn't really understand why we talk, or we used to talk, about birds and bees and sex for reproduction in humans. Birds and bees are absolutely critical for plants to have sex. Without them, no food. No bees, no food. No bees, no fruit and veg, because most plants absolutely dependent on the bees to do the work to transfer the sperm, if you like, the pollen from one flower to another. And if they don't successfully do that, most of our fruit and veg crops simply don't get pollinated if we have no pollen transfer, which is the male part of the flower. If there's no pollen transfer to the female part of the flower, you have no fertilization, and no fertilization, no fruit, no veg. So leafy greens, they're fine. They can cope without flowers, but anything that has a fruit, a product like a vegetable, any item like that, usually dependent on bees for those services. So we absolutely depend on our bees for most of our fruit and veg.
So Anastasia wants to ask, having a piece of toast in her hand with some honey on it, posted Professor Plummer, what am I eating, given that you've just described a very intimate act between plants? Where does the honey come in? She wants to know before she finishes her toast.
Yeah, so the honey is a product that the bees use. They get nectar from the plants that they pollinate. That's their reward for coming and doing the transfer of pollen. They consume some of the pollen and they produce the honey to feed their own offspring. They take the product, the nectar and the pollen back to the hive, and then they have to produce more, some food, some nutrition to feed the hive. And so within the hives, you have the honey produced that feeds the offspring of the bees. And so the cycle continues where you've got honey as a byproduct of that pollination service for all the fruit and veg. So both aspects are very important. But if we're starting to get a problem for our bees, we will have less likelihood or more expensive honey, because the honey production will start to go down once the bees aren't there to feed their offspring. The hives will die, and we're going to have a catastrophic problem for pollination, and as a consequence, no honey.
So Anastasia thoughtfully finishes her honey on toast. And I think this is an opportunity for us to make like the Premier of Queensland and eat some honey. So now if you've got a box, open the box up, and you should find some honey from the local producer in Bendigo, Collins Honey, and get your little jar of honey, open it up, stick a finger in, stick a spoon in, stick your tongue in, whatever, however you do your honey, pour it over your toast. And as you're eating it, think of it perhaps as Anastasia is thinking of it, she thinks this is sort of like bee milk, isn't it? So have a munch on that. And while you're exploring this new way to think about honey, we've got a little bit of a poll for you to do. Just here it comes. So there are bee colonies that do all of the fertilization that Kim Plummer was talking about, but many of the bees die. We've got a scenario here where many more bees than usual are dying, but in an ordinary year, how many of them would die? So we've got 21%, 35% votes. Let's see if we can get it over the 90% mark before we close the poll. Some people say 30 and some people say 10. It's very polarized one side or the other. Let's see if we can get a few more votes in, and then we'll progress with our hypothetical. We'll leave that poll running in the background to see if we can get a few more people to do it. So back to our hypothetical. So the Premier of Queensland has realized that there is a problem very likely with bees and pollination, but something must be done. And Kim, you call up your friend Travis Beddoe, because he's somebody who knows how to detect and fix diseases in animals, although bees may not be exactly his bag, baby. So Travis, you've got beeicide happening. First question is, what percentage of bees do normally die when you're going about your business when you're not in a beedemic?
Normally, particularly in certain crops like almonds, when bees needed 100% for that pollination, which Kim was explaining, they can up to 40% of the hive can die over that period of time while the flowers of the almonds are being flowered. So it is quite severe, particularly when you're doing a lot of monoculture, because bees, there's lots of multiple environmental stresses, factors, which cause bees to die. So we've got pathogens, what Kim was explaining, which are either these mites, which transmit viruses and bacteria. We have chemical exposure, pesticides, which are sprayed on those crops to protect them. We're having a lack of natural resources and the quality of that pollen and that reduced habitat are all having an effects on that bee health. So we need to figure out what's happening with those bees in Queensland.
So, Travis, you've been asked to fix this problem. Time is a wasting. The citizens of Australia are going without fruit and veg, which is a disaster in itself. How are you going to solve this problem? We don't know exactly how far it's spread. You don't know exactly where it is. What can you do? What techs do you have you help you out?
Yeah, so we need to figure out what type of pathogen or disease is being transmitted into the bees. And so once we know that, we can do that by sampling some of the dead bees and doing technology like sequencing the entire nucleic acid of the bees to figure out what the pathogen is. And from there, we've been pioneering a range of techniques which we can do in field testing. So you don't have to send the bees back to the lab. We can take the kids and give them a test kit as well as a magnifying glass and can send them out and use a technology called LAMP, which is a field-based PCR technology which you can do in the field. So once we figure out what the pathogen is, we can design a test for it, and then the kids can go out and test for it. And which that does is in real time. We can measure that within 20 minutes. We know whether that hive has that disease and the next hive doesn't. So then we can start doing quarantine around the healthy bees and quarantining them away from the infected bees. Just a bit like what we're doing down here in Melbourne at the moment.
There's a lot of bitter laughing for those if you're in Bendigo, Melbourne. We're starting to go a little bit shack wacky.
Yeah.
So, okay, so the slave labour from grades 2 and 3 in Queensland have sent a bunch of bees to your lab, and you do indeed find that it is a fungus that is responsible. The PCR kits are shipped out, and the kids look at it and say to themselves, "What is PCR?" Travis, what is PCR?
So PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. So basically, it is a technique where we can add in nucleic acid, DNA, with 2 small primers, and it uses an enzyme called polymerase, and it amplifies that DNA from a single copy into millions of copies, which we can see and detect using fluorescence or running on a gel and being able to detect that band. So it's a way of amplifying small amounts of DNA into large amounts of DNA. So it's like how they do it in the forensics. If anyone's watched CSI, it's basically that type of technology.
So the primary school kids been calling themselves now the bee scene investigators, and they're running around doing all of this PCR testing to try and get to find out how fast this is spreading and possibly how it can be fixed. While this is going on in the background, we do have the serious problem that the supermarkets are empty of fruit and veg, and breakfast cereal may not cut it. Kim Plummer gets on the phone to Susan Macleod and says, "Susan, what are we going to do about the fruit and veg situation? What is this going to do to the diet and the health of these Queenslanders and the rest of Australia as it spreads south?"
Well, it's going to be a serious problem. So fruit and veg is a large part of a healthy diet. It's our primary source of vitamins and minerals, of dietary fiber. It's linked to disease prevention, things like cancer, type 2 diabetes, heart disease. So if we don't have fruit and veg as a main part of our diet, then I can see that we're going to end up with a lot of really unhealthy people who are not getting their vitamins and minerals.
Scott Morrison realizes something must be done and promptly orders in 25,000 tonnes of multivitamins from one of his friends in the UK and proceeds to mail a bottle to every household in Australia and says quite proudly, "Susan, problem solved. Next." What's your reaction, Susan?
That is not the problem solved at all. So multivitamins are good for some people, and some types of fortification are really great. So if we think of things like folic acid for pregnant women, that's excellent and really has a place in our society. But vitamin and mineral pills, in order to meet our dietary needs, is just not going to cut it. We still need to get the dietary fiber. We still need to have that food as part of our diet, because it's a fruit and veg are a really low kilojoule way to have a filling meal that isn't high in other things, like, you know, high in perhaps unhealthy fats or things like that, where we are requiring that sensation of being full at the end of a meal. So yeah, it's just not going to cut it.
The people in Canberra nod and smile and listen very carefully, but in one ear, when they've got you talking, in the other ear, they have the beef farming lobby that has said, you know, beef is a great source of vitamin B12 and it's got all of these big benefits. Let's get people to eat more beef. All we need to do is increase the amount of pasture land. Australia's got plenty of real estate, not a problem. They ring up Jim Radford and say, hey, Jim, we really want to go big on beef in Australia. We think it's a great thing. If we give you a couple of $1 million, can you put your stamp on this as a serious boffin to say, yes, beef is good? We'll buy you a house.
Apart from sending them to the ICC for about corruption, the serious answer is grazing livestock is very resource intensive. It uses a lot of water. It can take anywhere between 500 to 15,000 litres of water to produce a kilogram of beef, depending on where it's grown and whether it's irrigated pasture or rain-fed pasture, and how much of it is finished off on grains, things like that may also have been used irrigation to grow those grains. We know that growing meat is the most greenhouse gas intensive form of growing protein. And from a biodiversity perspective, perhaps the most important factor is that the vast majority of land clearing in Australia and globally is basically for the production of meat, to increase pastures to grow meat. And that is the single most important cause of habitat loss in this country, which is the single most important cause of biodiversity loss. So there are massive environmental issues and consequences associated with growing livestock and growing meat. Having said that, we can do better than we are currently doing, and there are examples that we can point to. New grazing practices, producers that grow exclusively or transforming towards growing on perennial native pastures that mean their environmental impact is considerably lower. Combined with lower inputs, fertilisers, pesticides, herbicides, these sorts of things, it can drastically reduce the environmental impact of growing livestock, particularly where those pastures already exist. It can also reduce the amount of methane produced by cows. So growing on a diverse diet of native pastures, and increasingly there's research looking at microbial supplements to change the gut microbiome of cows to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So there are ways and new technologies to ameliorate some of those impacts. We can know that it can be just as profitable for farmers too to use these regenerative practices. Maybe lower inputs, maybe slightly lower production, but profit-wise, it's just as good for the farmer if they can produce their beef sustainably and in an environmentally friendly way.
So
having said all that, we also have an alternative. Sorry to keep going there. We have a high protein, low fat, environmentally friendly protein bounding around most of our landscapes. And it is massively underutilised. And that resource is our macropods, our kangaroos and our wallabies, which have less of an impact on the land, coexist with the ecosystems that are out there, and, well, I think taste pretty good.
So the beef industry go away with a bit of a flea in the ear because they wasn't quite what they were looking for, but what the hey. And they say, ScoMo, this Radford guy's, he's lost the plot. He reckons we should be eating Skippy. And the guys in Canberra are like, look, that's not going to play well in the electorate. But he does have a point, is this might actually be the solution we're looking for, but will it play? And so they decide they're going to run a focus group in Bendigo, in fact, at the Bendigo Tech School. And that's you, folks in the audience. So you hold the fate of the sector in your hands. Would you eat a kangaroo? And remember, this is going to be used to inform our hypothetical Prime Minister's legislative choices in Canberra. So let's see if we can get as many people voting as possible. I think most people are pretty keen on the Roo, I've got to say. I will confess I had a kangaroo minced chili last night, so I'm biased, so I can't vote. I'll let that run in the background a little bit, but the trend seems very clear that kangaroo is a great alternative. So the decision is made to start eating kangaroos and wallabies, and the efforts to harvest and butcher these is upscaled. In the political tumult that follows, a Green Party decides that there's an opportunity here, because if we switch our consumption from beef grazing to kangaroos, that liberates some pasture, and that could be turned into a national park and be reclaimed by nature. And so now you find that there are some environmental lobby groups, Jim, knocking on your door, asking you if it's okay if they say that this is all this pasture is going to go back to nature if we just leave it alone and let Gaia take it over. What's your response to this suggestion?
Well, firstly, I'm glad that ScoMo has found his inner green. So I don't quite know where that's come from, but that's potentially a good sign. There is potential there, undoubtedly there is potential there. So, you know, an emerging field of natural ecosystem regeneration, if you like, or restoration. We've come a long way in knowing that, in being able to improve the composition and the complexity of our revegetation, from planting trees in rows to multi-species, complex systems. We know that when we replant vegetation in farmland, native species will colonise that, and they will come and they will use it, particularly things like birds. They'll get inflow of seeds brought in by the birds often, or the wind, so we'll get some colonisation by some other native plant species that we didn't necessarily plant in the ground or have in the original seed mix. Vertebrates will colonise and gradually we'll start to rebuild the ecosystem. So if we plant it, to a certain extent they will come, and this will have benefits at the landscape level for many species by increasing the amount of habitat that's available for them, and importantly by increasing the connectivity to allow species to move around the landscape and spread, allow them to disperse and increase their population. So there will be benefits, but it's not that we can magically return cropland or old pasture to pristine wilderness, depending on, particularly if it was a woodland or a forest or a shrubland that it was previously before it was turned into pasture. If it was a grassland and it hasn't been cultivated after many, many years and reducing applications of fertilizers and things, we may be able to bring it back to some sort of a state resembling its pre-farming state. But in many cases, we've lost the seed source, we've lost the propagules, we've lost a lot of the species from those landscapes that make an ecosystem what it is, that are the composite species that mean that is the pristine wilderness that we're seeking. So there's a lot of benefits to come from it in terms of carbon sequestration and improved aesthetic benefit and all sorts of things. But thinking that we can return pasture to pristine wilderness is probably a little bit beyond the pale. We are, I think, better off, you know, trying to grow more from our existing pasture and protect and better manage our natural areas and make sure we preserve our unique and irreplaceable nature in those nature reserves.
So the Greens delegation goes back up to Canberra, having scratched their chin a little bit, much wiser for the result of it. But the decisions made that on net benefit, we will stop grazing beef and do something around the carbon sequestration, with an acknowledgement that it will not revert back to the pristine nature it was before. This is extremely popular, and the Morrison government is voted in on a platform of green and environmental awareness with a thumping majority. So everyone up there is particularly pleased, except for the opposition, of course, but that's their job. However, there are some unintended consequences of this move. The kangaroo and wallaby population is unfortunately not quite enough to meet the dietary and lifestyle needs of 20 odd million Australians. And there's a bit of a gap where the steaks and the pork chops used to be. So the electorate is starting to turn against this green platform that was so successful at the previous election. And once again, the government is getting worried. They pick up the phone to their favourite expert on matters dietary, Susan Macleod. How are we going to plug this gap where there's not enough kangaroo to go around and there's no longer any beef?
There are a lot of crops that we can turn to that are excellent sources of protein and have the added benefit of also having dietary fibre, which is essential in our diet. So we can look at things like whole grains. For example, oats is an excellent whole grain that we can consume that has excellent levels of protein and dietary fibre. We can look at things like hemp seeds is another whole grain that we can consume. We can also look at things like legumes or nuts. For example, almonds are really high in protein. So, and they also have the added benefit of having healthy fats in them. So there are many other options that we can choose to grow as far as crops to fill that need.
ScoMo was nodding and smiling as you said all that. And then at one point he stops and says, Susan, are you proposing what I thought you just proposed, that we should eat marijuana? Is that legal?
It's not quite marijuana. It is, so hemp seeds are a highly nutritious whole grain that we can consume that doesn't have that same effect that perhaps some of our our participants or people in the audience may know marijuana to be typically, without suggesting anything.
So ScoMo's still not convinced, but you'll just quietly let that one go. And this is now an opportunity for those of you at home who've got a box to think about how you would plug this gap that's been left where you might normally be eating meat. And in your box, you've got a sachet of muesli, which has got oats, which are absolutely fantastic, as Susan was saying, and lots of nuts in them. So I invite you to rip that open and get some of that in your mouth and have a munch while we continue with a hypothetical. As a result of the disruption to the Australian agricultural sector, because remember, we still haven't exactly cured the bee problem yet. It's still festering. We're still short on fruit and veg, and then we've lost the meat as well. It's getting dark. The economy is tanking. It's falling to levels of not been seen since the terrible COVID-19 epidemic of 2020, when nobody was able to work because everyone was locked indoors. Unemployment is rising. However, there is an entrepreneur, a mining magnate called Clive Drama, who has got a wonderful idea on how to solve all these problems. He has been noting that when you go into the expensiver coffee shops, you can get oat milk and almond milk and pay twice as much for it. And he realizes that almonds are a source of great nutrition because of the work of Susan Macleod and others. And he thinks, I know what we'll do. Where there used to be all this fruit and veg we were growing along the Murray, we'll slap in almond trees and we'll turn it all into almond milk, and then we'll sell it and we'll make a fortune. So he proposes doing this. however, some people are concerned. And so a local farmers cooperative in the Riverina goes to Jim Radford and says, Jim, is Clive drama on the money here, or is we missing something?
Well, I think Clive's actually just reimagining the great almond expansion of about the late 2010s, because in actual fact, that's already happening, and we've seen a massive expansion in almond, amount of land under almond pasture in the lower Murray-Darling system. But almonds are also very thirsty, about 10,000 litres of water for a kilogram of almond kernels. So if that's the way we want to use our water, and that's the source of protein to compensate for loss in other food sources, so be it. But we must be wary that despite improvements in water delivery and irrigation, and we can reduce water loss through mulching and ground cover and things like that, if we continue to remove water from the Murray-Darling Basin, it will have significant environmental impacts, as we've seen. So we'll all remember the great fish deaths of the summer of 2019, January 2019, when the lower Murray-Darling was choked with dying fish. That was very visible, and that rose that issue to the surface, pardon the pun there. But there are many other, perhaps less visible impacts of overuse of water from the Murray-Darling system, and indeed many of our irrigation systems. So we've seen massive river red gum tree dieback along great stretches of our great rivers. We've lost 80% of our water birds in the Murray-Darling Basin over the last 2 or 3 decades, and that's largely due to wetlands and rivers not having as much water in them for as long. We've seen floodplain health decline. As I mentioned, impacts of wetlands not being filled as often or as long, so significant impacts on fish, birds, frogs, mammals, all sorts of things. So we need to try and find that balance between environment and production, so that we do have the food sources that we require. And as I mentioned before, also, the impacts of this reaches way beyond just the natural environment. The impacts on the human systems in the basin of having no water is incredible as well, and impacts on mental health and well-being and recreational services and things like that, which come into play. So I would advise ScoMo and his advisors to think very carefully about how they use water in the MDB, and that there are a range of other equally important and in fact economically critical services that water can be used for.
Unfortunately, Clive Drama decides he doesn't care about the water skiers or the fish, and he goes ahead and plants hectare upon hectare of this supposed mother lode of almonds. Unfortunately, they grow, suck up all the water, but do not yield. So Clive gets on Zoom with Kim Plummer and says, Kim, my folks in Canberra tell me you're the woman to sort this out. What gives?
So yet again, do we have an issue with bees? Do we have a different issue? What's causing the problem? With my plant doctor investigator hat on, I need to ask more questions, need to send out my researchers to go and have a look, even perhaps looking at whether there's any reports to the exotic pest hotline, or even just looking at Google searches to see what farmers are actually Googling. That might give us some information as to what's actually going on. But really, we need boots on the ground to have a look at those trees and work out whether there's plenty of bees or not, or whether the trees themselves are catching a disease or not.
So Clive gets 747 full of grade 3 kids from Queensland, flies them down, flies Travis up to manage them. Travis, what are your creative solutions here? There don't seem to be any bees. They're not finding any bees at all. The kids are very beside themselves. Are there any technical solutions that we can use to just quickly get the almonds pollinated and get the crop out?
Yeah, so almonds need bees for 100% pollination. Without bees, the plants are probably not being able to grow. So if there's no bees, we need another alternative, and we could start using robotic drones. We can train all those kids. They're really good on Xbox games. So the perfect control units, we can retrain them to fly little drones around and pollinate the almond trees.
Clive absolutely loves this idea, goes out and buys 10,000 bee drones from Harvard University, which is where this research takes place, amongst others. We've got a video we might play later if you're interested. The almond trees bear fruit, good crop, but then the almond trees develop these black growths on the sides of their trunks, and about 30% of them start to die. So Clive rings up Kim again and says, all right, Kim, what's happening this time? Kim Plummer.
Well, it sounds like the almond trees have got more problems rather than just the bees. The little bee bots have done their thing, but big black gashes or cankers on the trunk suggests to me that we've got a disease happening, a disease outbreak down in that region as well. So that could be a number of different causes. Most likely cause is something that's not a fungus, but it's like a fungus. It's something called Phytophthora. The word Phytophthora, this genus of fungi-like organisms, actually means plant destroyer. So we are in trouble. A Phytophthora effectively caused a famine in Ireland because the Irish were dependent on a single crop, on potatoes, for their nutrition. So it's sort of, if we've learnt nothing from history, there's a lesson there about not being dependent on one particular crop. And our what's happening in these almonds, we need to get in there and look at what we can do in the short term and then in the longer term for how to control this possible, firstly to find out if it is this particular disease causing organism or a different one, and then see what we can do in terms of control for that, and see if it's something that we already knew was here in Australia, or whether that's something that it's new that has come into Australia and we need to put a quarantine, a ring fence around that area to stop it spreading, potentially spreading to other crops as well. Now, we need to find out what that disease, or what's causing that disease, so that we can work out whether other crops are at risk also. So some pathogens, the microbes that cause the disease, some pathogens will be specific to almonds, but some might spread to apricots and other fruit trees in the Riverina district as well. So we really need to do that detective work and find out what's the cause and what solutions can we come up with. First, short term, is it something we need to protect from other crops, or indeed look at a control option immediately and then contain that, or indeed look at a longer term option as well to ensure that these crop species are not threatened by this particular disease.
So our mining magnate come agricultural entrepreneur here's what you say, Kim, but he thinks there's a simpler solution, and that is just to kill it with fire. He's going to use broad-based antifungal to try and spray to kill whatever this canker is and get his almond trees back to life. Jim, you're watching this along with Travis, but what's your reaction to broad-based anti-fungicides on a crop like almonds?
Well, I'd be very worried about what's happening in the soil with the use of an anti-fungicide like that. And we're probably biting off our nose to spite our face with the use of the broad-based antifungals as we completely destroy the soil biome that's supporting the almond trees in the first place. So I'd also be worried about those robobots and whether they've been responsible for spreading some of that disease around, and thinking maybe we should have looked at our native bees and our native wasps and maybe tried to redesign a landscape so that we have a more abundant and a better service being provided through our native species. We don't know very much about whether our native bees and wasps and moths and the like, whether they're very good at pollinating commercial crops. We suspect they might not be, but we also don't really know a lot. There's many of them out there that require a lot more research on that specificity. So that would be my major fear about using a broad-based antifungal, is we might get rid of the fungus, but we might also have a soil that can't grow anything.
Increasingly desperate Clive Drama thinks he needs to reach for the big guns in science, and he read in an article in the Mirror that there was this thing called genetically modified crops. And so while he's got Kim Plummer on speed dial, he decides he's going to try her and say, Kim, can you make me some Franken almonds that I don't need to spray, but that are going to be invulnerable to this fungus?
Well, we would have to do a lot of research to actually work out how to combat this fungus. Firstly, is it a fungus at all in the first place? And whether there are any plants out there that have any easily transferable disease resistance genes, so genes that help protect the plant against that particular disease causing organism. Now, with something like this Phytophthora thing, there's very little resistance out there to start with anyway, and it will attack many, many species. But there are potentially some disease resistant crops out there that might be better than others, and transferring, if we can identify the genes, and that's not trivial, although with the new technologies that we understood, and we got a lot of learnings from COVID-19, we started to understand about this thing called genomics, where you could sequence the whole genome of something like a virus. And that's easy because there's only a handful of genes in a virus. But now, because of the cheap cost of sequencing and how much we've advanced in the years since COVID, we now can sequence genomes of plants and indeed of the pathogens, the microbes that cause that disease. So we can start to get an understanding of what's causing the disease and indeed how to fight back. This image I've got in my background here is actually an apple leaf. And what we see in those little rings are actually patches of cells, little apple cells, hundreds of apple cells that have gathered together as a group to fight back against a little dark patch right in the middle there. It's actually a little jelly bean, looks like a little jelly bean. It's actually a fungal spore that has tried to attack that apple leaf, and a whole group of apple cells have ganged up and produced this fluorescing compound quite naturally that can fight back and ring fence that pathogen and block its entry into the plant. So plants do have natural disease resistance. Identifying that is the trick before we could then try and transfer the resistance into almonds. But if we looked, for example, in an apricot and found that apricots that were growing alongside the almonds weren't getting infected by this disease, we could look and try and understand why that is. And then potentially, if we found the genes or the gene that was in those apricots, we could transfer that into almonds. We can't do that by traditional breeding, by crossing an almond with an apricot, but we could do that with genetic engineering. It's not trivial to understand what is the gene or what are the genes, plural, in the almond that are protecting the almond from that attack. And, you know, protecting the apricot from attack that the almond doesn't have, so we could transfer the apricot genes into the almond. So that's possible, but it would take a lot of money, Clive. And, you know, the government have been really cutting down on plant research over the last 50 years. And so we really need the government on board with this to stump up for some good cash investment into plant disease and finding out how plants fight back against, you know, these pathogens and win the war over disease.
So Clive Drama hears you, Kim, and he goes to Canberra and asks the government there if they would please stump up a handy couple of billion to make this happen and rescue his almond venture. However, in Canberra, they have heard rumblings about this before, and they're not convinced that the public would stand for eating genetically modified almond milk in their in their latte. So they once again go for their favourite and most reliable focus group, which is the focus group in Bendigo, which is us or you. So now we have a poll about would you eat genetically modified almonds? Remember, this is going to determine the outcome of the scenario a little bit as well.
And David, can we say that the genetic modification has come from an apricot? The genes have come from apricot into almond. That might influence people.
Yes, that's a very good point. It hasn't come from some ununderstandable, unrelatable source. It's good old-fashioned fruit that we know. The trend seems pretty clear that most people would in fact eat genetically modified almonds, which is extremely useful. The The Morrison government has declared a state of emergency and a state of disaster, because if you remember, we still don't have any fruit and veggies. We don't have any beef or pork at the moment. What kangaroos and wallabies we've got isn't enough to go around. There needs to be some way of balancing the diet here. There's got to be a way that it doesn't matter whether it is going to be popular or not. We've just got to make sure that the population is fed properly. Once again, they call on Susan Macleod. Susan, help.
So I think that we're one of the best ideas that we've got is legumes. Legumes are an absolute superfood. They are packed full of fantastic nutrients. They're high in protein. They've got good dietary fiber. They have got many other benefits, which I'll leave to other experts to discuss. But as far as nutrients go, they're amazing, and they should be included as part of a healthy diet at least 3 or 4 times a week. So I think that perhaps it's time that we consider legumes as an option. We have so many available in our supermarkets already. We're seeing them trending in products now. We've got lots of legume flours, we've got legume pastas, noodles. There are so many things already in our supermarkets. The things that you can do and make with them are amazing. So I think that's the way to go.
Okay, well, I'm not going to argue with an expert. Everyone who's got a box, if you look in there, you should find a little package of legumes. I think some people have chickpeas and some people have fava beans. It depends exactly which box you've got, but they're quite easy to see, and they're delicious. So pull them open, get yourself a little bit of nutrition, and we just want to do a bit of a poll. We want to find out how legume friendly you guys are. So there's a whole bunch of products there: lentil pasta, chickpea flour, mung bean noodles, aquafaba, black bean noodles, fava beans. I like fava beans with a nice Chianti myself, and bean burger. Aquafaba, apparently you can make meringues from aquafaba. So there's a challenge for you. If you fancy yourself as being a good baker, see if you can make a pavlova out of the juice from the chickpea tin. Put your photos up on the socials. I am absolutely obsessed with this idea, as the rest of the team will tell you. I reckon it could be the most modern Australian thing that ever happened. We need a few more voters just to sort of get our data set up, because we are, after all, scientists, and we are very interested to find out what your experience with these things is. So we'll let that poll run in the background, but it seems that most people have had fava beans and black beans, but they haven't gone the mung beans, which is extremely interesting. So Kim Plummer, Clive Drama has come back with his 5 billion. You're in the money. So you can put together your dream team, and you can start getting to the genetic modification of almonds and all of the other things that need to be done around disease resistance, which is good news, because we've still got the bees dying up in Queensland and they're coming down. So there's a lot of work to be done there, but 5 billion will go a long way. It'll buy a lot of test tubes and cups of coffee. You've reached out for another expert from La Trobe that you've worked with, Kim Johnson, and you've been asked to prepare a report on whether Australia could cultivate legumes en masse in a large scale. Is it possible to just go huge on legumes and feed the population while we sort out all these other problems? So, Kim Johnson, can we grow legumes in the desert? What's the story?
Well, legumes are amazing. They're already part of Australian agriculture, so they're already there. And there's lots of different types, as you just saw from that polling. There's the fava beans, the chickpeas, the mung beans, lentils. So because there's so many different types of legumes, you can grow them in all different parts of Australia. So that's really fantastic. And, you know, as I said, they're already part of Australian agriculture. They're about 10 to 20%, depending on the year, but we can increase that. That can be more. And what's really important about legumes is how much they fit into a sustainable agriculture system. So they actually improve the productivity of other crops, broadacre crops like wheat and oats and barley. So they're really important because they're used in rotation with these other crops, and because they have this amazing ability to fix nitrogen. So they can take nitrogen out of the air, put it in the soil, and that's what's often added as a fertilizer, but you get free fertilizer when you incorporate legumes into these rotations. So they give a really important benefit, not only for themselves to help themselves grow, but also to other crops to help them grow. And also when you use legumes in rotation with these other crops, you break up the disease. So Kim's talked a lot about diseases. So if you keep growing wheat year after year after year, you're going to get disease in that system. But if you break that up, because legumes have different diseases to what you have with other grains, then you can break that disease cycle. So that's also really, really important as a sustainable agriculture management. So, you know, we can definitely increase the amount of legumes that we're growing in the Australian system. A lot of what we actually grow now gets exported. It gets exported to different countries around Asia. So if there was a more reliable market in Australia, if we just ate more of them, then farmers would also be encouraged to grow, you know, with this reliable supply, both in Australia and externally, you know, they'd definitely grow more. We do need to do a bit of work. So, you know, we can improve legumes. They haven't had the same attention as wheat has, for example, which has been bred for, you know, 10,000 years and it's really been optimized to be an extremely efficient crop. So we can increase the efficiency of legumes as well, just on the land that we do have. And that can be through understanding better this interaction that the legumes have with the nitrogen fixing bacteria. So it's actually bacteria which manage to fix this nitrogen out of the air, and the legumes form a little house for them, and they do an exchange of goods. So we can understand that a lot better. We can also understand a bit better about their drought and cold tolerance, because that can limit where we can grow them. You said in the desert, well, you know, we just need to understand their drought tolerance. And also they're usually pretty cold sensitive as well. So, you know, and also the other thing is flowering, you know, just understanding when are they most sensitive to different things like a heat wave, you know. Is that during when they're flowering or when they're setting seed? So if we can understand those types of things, we know when to plant them and when there's the best timing for them to grow their best.
So this is the decision is made. Australia is fed off a huge upscale of legume production, and it becomes a huge export market. The Plummer Institute finds a way to genetically modify almonds as described, and so Clive is very, very happy and has a large amount of almond milk that he can flood the market with. And he is joined by many other agricultural entrepreneurs, and the market has now got a large amount of legume-based alternate meats. All of this stuff tastes delicious, looks awesome, and is processed to within an inch of its life. It's not just raw beans, it's been mixed with fillers and flavor enhancers, but it's still legumes. Susan Macleod, you're watching what's going on here. Are you happy now that everyone's eating more legumes in this way?
No, actually, I'm horrified. The more that we process foods, the more potential there is to destroy those essential nutrients, which is the reason why we eat them in the first place. Having meat alternatives is okay for some of the time, but if we're not getting our B12, which is primarily found in animal-based products, so meats, milk, cheese, butter, things like that, then we're not getting our B12, then we're going to all be tired and lethargic. That's going to have other consequences. So meat-based alternatives based on legumes is not the answer, and processing them to within an inch of their life is not the answer either. We need a whole range of foods to be healthy. We need diversity. We need to have foods that are minimally processed. Processing is good. Cooking food is good, but we don't need to process them within an inch of their life to the point where we're destroying the nutrients.
Well, fast forward 6 months in the future, and after the Australian populace is getting tired of a diet of almond milk and Clive burgers, and decides to broaden their palate somewhat. But good news is at hand. Thanks to every primary school child in Australia being given an Xbox controller and a handful of bee bots, the pollination crisis in Queensland has been solved. Horticulture survives. Fruit and vegetables come back on the menu, boys. In the process, this has bought the Plummer Institute enough time to be able to track down exactly what the bee fungus was, and Travis Beddoe manages to find a detection and treatment regime. The upshot of this is that the Australian populace has now got a balanced diet of a combination of macropods, some of the remaining beef, and these new legumes. And in the process, these export markets have been created. Australia is now a centre of excellence for genetic modification. It is producing legumes and shipping them all over the world, creating billions of dollars. The mining industry becomes much less important, and so Clive Drama's key influence manages to ebb and wane slightly, and he decides that he's going to go to the Philippines and sells all of his almond farms, and they can now revert back to apples and the riverina horticulture that they were previously. So this is wrapping up the scenario here on a good note to say that with an adventure that you've joined us on, if we all work together as scientists, there are many ways to do it. And so here we are 10 years in the future, and Australia is stronger, happier, and healthier as a result of finding creative solutions to all of these problems. I'd very much appreciate you playing this game with us. I've had a great time. And I'd like to hand over to the project lead, Kim Johnson, just to sort of make some framing remarks, and then we can do some Q&A.
Yeah, well, I'm really keen to hear questions from the audience, but I think what you've emphasised there, David, is there's no one solution. These are complex problems. We've got a lot of challenges with climate change, with degrading soil, with disease, and we need a whole range of experts working together. So everyone from the nutritionist to the plant doctors, the animal disease specialists, the ecologists. We really need all these people working together to find really sensible solutions. And that's what we've tried to do here. And look, research can then support these producers to produce the food that we need in a really sustainable way. And there's such opportunities. There's opportunities for people who are interested in STEM to come and help us and be part of the solution. And there's opportunities, there's careers in agriculture and food and research, and we want you to come and help because there's going to be challenges in the future that we haven't even seen yet. And so we really need great minds that are out there to come and help us.
Thank you very much, Kim. We've got some fantastic questions. Already possibly more than can be answered in the time. So if we don't get to your question, please chuck us an email or get on the socials, and we're very happy to answer it to you if we don't have time today. First question I'm probably going to throw to you, Jim, but maybe some other people as well. Are there symbiotic plant species that live together well and collectively promote cross-pollination and disease management? In other words, have we researched plant collectives that work together most efficiently? I think that's a brilliant question. We touched on it in nitrogen fixation arc, but Jim, what are your thoughts on this idea of getting different sorts of plants to work symbiotically?
Yeah, absolutely there is. So Kim mentioned it in terms of crop rotations. So in that sense, it's more one crop at one time and then another crop at another. I think the question here really goes to complementary species and to polyculture. And so having multiple crops, multiple species being grown at the same time in the same paddock. And yes, there is, there is good evidence to suggest that diversity of crops does build resilience into the system, does provide some level of disease resistance and facilitation. For example, as Kim was saying, a nitrogen fixing species helps fix the nitrogen, which is then into the soil, which is then used by other species. So there are combinations, excuse me, of species that will increase productivity. The issue is often in Australian agricultural systems is the scale at which we do things, which is very mechanised and very heavily dependent on large scale machinery, which is often fine-tuned to or designed for monocultures. But there are farmers out there who are very successfully using this mixed cropping type of approach, and you're still using heavy machinery. They're still large scale, broad acre farmers, but are finding that they can sow and grow and harvest multiple crops in the same paddock with massive reductions in their need for chemicals and increased yield. So it's definitely an area that is on the up and is yeah, definitely something we need to continue to promote.
Thanks, Jim. That's very encouraging. I see you, Kim. I'll come back to you if we've got time, because there's a question I've got to ask Travis. One thing we didn't kill in this scenario, because we killed just about everything else, we didn't have a go at the Ruse and the Wallabies. But in practice, are there diseases in Ruse and Wallabies? And would this actually, how sensible would it be to try and do what we're proposing?
Yeah, there has been reports of mass mortality in kangaroos in New South Wales in just the early 2000s, and the pathogen or disease vector or what it wasn't determined. The other thing we probably would need to look at, there's a parasite called Leishmania, which infects kangaroos in Australia. At the moment, we don't get any human infections from that because we don't have the insect vector to transmit that from the blood-sucking kangaroo to humans. But there is a potential if we start eating kangaroos that we may get transmission of some of these diseases which haven't been studied.
That ties in nicely to a question that is in one of the audience members had, which is, as we look for alternative food sources, do we risk the potential for how we got into the COVID-19 situation in the first place? Well, I don't know if they've actually worked out exactly how the COVID-19 virus jumped the species bat, or whether it was bat soup like the photos imply, or whether it was something a little bit more subtle. But certainly that has been a problem in other pandemics. Kim Plummer, I just wanted to go back to you, because I think you wanted to add something to what Jim was saying about the synergies.
Just my point was that for broadacre cropping for pastures, mixed crops are quite effective, but for horticulture crops, one of the biggest reasons for planting a monoculture, that is all the same trees, all at the one, the one species, is that we have our biggest expense is that we need the fruit to all be ripe at the same time so that it is affordable to harvest them. The question also asked about cross-pollination. Well, again, if you have two very different species, they cannot cross-pollinate each other. They need the same species, maybe a different cultivar. A Royal Gala apple crossed with a Jonathan apple will maybe cross-pollinate, but there's a very important imperative about the fruit that you're harvesting, or the component of the crop that you're harvesting has to be harvested in a way that's economically viable. And that's why they take through the big machines, because you can't go in and hand pick and separate out the grains for a grain, a broadacre crop. And it's even more problematic when, under COVID-19, now more than ever, we are experiencing the difficulty with getting people who are really skilled at picking fruit. One of the biggest expenses for a grower is getting the teams in to be able to pick their fruit in an economical, in an affordable way. And the Pacific Islanders, that often are a big labour force because they're really good at it, they're efficient, they're capable, they've got good camaraderie and good efficiency for getting those crops in. Some of those folks can't come in. And so that's a really big problem that sort of is a push and pull with, yes, we've got a whole crop of apples in there, but so that they're all ripe at the same time, they can be harvested together. But if we start mixing everything up, they ripen at a different time, it becomes not affordable for harvesting. Thanks, and Kim. There was a question about speeding up nut production, if you want me to
I might come back to that in a minute. I wanted to, sorry, I just need to quickly check. So there's an issue, Travis, I wanted to come to a comment that you actually made in the back end chat while we were progressing. You said that broad-based antifungi in agriculture has led to the rise of multi-drug resistant fungi, Candida auris, in humans. That sounds pretty scary. Do you want to just explain a little bit what you meant there?
Yeah, when Jim was explaining about the use of broad-based antifungals and how it gets into the soil, reminded me of this fungal disease, which is now becoming a large problem in hospitals. Climate change, temperatures are warmed up, fungi is starting to become a major problem in a range of plants as well as animals. And this fungi hadn't been seen before, but until it started appearing in hospitals. And it's multi-drug resistant, can't treat it. And once it's in the hospitals, it's very hard to get out of the hospital. And so when people started looking at where the potential sources of it appear to be, that from agriculture and spraying broad-based fungicides have caused, combined with climate change, has made this soil-dwelling fungi now a human pathogen, where before it wasn't. So this is the problem when you start spraying discriminatory pesticides all over the environment. You have these unconsequented things, and especially with climate change now, we're going to see more fungal diseases appear, which is unfortunate. And that's starting to appear now.
That's a very interesting, more argument for doing things like this multi-cropping that we were talking about, and perhaps genetic modification as well. There's another question about multi-cropping coming up. Kim Plummer, I might throw to Kim Johnson for the nut production question, just to sort of give everyone a chance to speak. So Kim Johnson, when you're looking at genetically modified almonds, just sort of hypothetically, is there potential to use genetic modification techniques to speed up the length to producing nut? In other words, limiting the need for grafting?
Well, there's genetically modified is one tool, right? So there's other tools that you can use in terms of just a genome-assisted breeding is a really popular one that people are using at the moment. So Kim mentioned the sequencing that you can do of lots of plant species or animal species now, and by doing that you can find good genes, or genes that are really helpful. So that's something you can do, and then breeders can use this information to help just breed faster. So that's something they can do. So GM is one option. This is another way of supporting it. And look, we need to use everything we've got. I think we can use all these technologies, and we should be, because nuts do take a long time to grow. They take a long time to produce, but we can speed those things up just by understanding how plants grow and looking, as Kim said, at a diverse range of plant species and how they do it, because we've got so many different resources already out there that we can be looking into and learning from. And yes, we can try and just use our scientific methods to understand what it is that makes these plants flower, what are the triggers, also that seed production, that nut production, understanding that process, what can we do to speed it up.
Thanks, Kim. Kim Plummer, I've got a question about olives for you. I'm a physicist, so I'm just going to mispronounce this badly. I apologize in advance.
I can handle it if you want. The Xylella question.
Thank you. Go for it.
Yeah, Xylella fastidiosa. It's a picky little bacterium that's basically causing, or it has caused, the demolition of all of the olives grown in the heel of the bush in Italy, and it's creeping its way up out of the heel and into the rest of the olive production regions, and all attempts to stop it have basically failed. So Xylella, funny little name, but it's basically a bacterium that lives in the xylem, in the water vessels of the plants. And this is a really big issue that can potentially spread to other crops. Olives, again, can be vulnerable. And so we really need to understand how to limit the attack by Xylella, how to make sure we keep it out Do not bring products in from overseas. There's a really good reason why we have such intensive quarantine surveillance, so that people don't bring organisms like Xylella and other nasties that are really hard to, people have been trying for a very long time. And, you know, socially in that area of Italy, you've got trees that are hundreds and hundreds of years old that have been planted by great-grandfather so-and-so. And so they're having to be destroyed to try and protect the spread of this bacterium. We don't have a solution. They do not allow the spread of the application of antibiotics against bacterial diseases in Australia. It's absolutely forbidden for the reasons that Travis outlined. We do not use antibiotics in our plant agricultural systems. And so we are really stuck in terms of how to contain a bacterial disease like that if it gets in. So right now, I mean, the plant breeding for disease resistance is something that could be looked at, and maybe genetic modification in there, but really keeping it out is our biggest weapon, our best weapon, our good, solid biosecurity to block those plant infecting pathogens from getting into Australia in the first place. But we need everyone to do the right thing, and people are caught all the time trying to bring in plant products illegally. So we really need everyone to do the right thing, because they can bring in, without realizing it, the microbes that are actually going to put our agriculture at risk. Really extremely important.
Thanks, Kim. That's a really important point to make. Something which you also pointed out in rehearsals, and Kim Johnson has reminded us, it's the year of plant health this year. 2020 is the International Year of Plant Health. So keep your plants healthy, people. We've got about a minute and a half. Jim, I want to do 2 quickies for you to finish up on. One is, someone's asked, is the kangaroo meat that we're eating now safe?
Yeah, I mean, it is tested. It goes through, you know, human consumption health tests. To my knowledge, there's no evidence of any risk of the diseases that kangaroos have been transferred into humans. So I eat it. I'm comfortable eating it.
Cool, that's good to hear. And the final question is, picking up on a comment which you made in the chat earlier. You said that there's a way that you can have mechanical harvesters that can harvest 2 crops at once. Do you just want to briefly explain how that works?
Yeah, well, I mean, taking in broadacre cropping, so things that are harvested by machinery, by headers, generally that works by, you know, moving the tops of the grains through a harvester, a roller type thing, and then that separates the stalk, the chaff, from the seed, the grain, and that is what goes into the container for harvesting. And generally, most headers, that's just a single size, or that can be changed. They can change the size of the holes that are in the rolling thing that separate the grain from the stalk. There are harvesters now that have multiple different size holes, so that as they're going along, they can separate different size grains. So as long as your multi-crop production system has grains that are of considerably different sizes, so like a pulse with a wheat, you know, chickpea and a wheat and a barley or something like that, then you can separate them on the go. So you can do that mechanically, so that you can still do it economically. So slightly different situations like Kim Plum was talking about in terms of hand picking fruit and seasonality and things like that, but just in these cropping systems, it can be done.
Thanks, Jim. And we're out of time. So at that, I'm going to wrap it up. Apologies to those of you, a couple of questions didn't get to answer, but can I encourage you to pop on to the socials? There's a Taste of Tomorrow website too, which has heaps and heaps of resources. So we're going to do a screen share, I think now, Lena, where you're going to, a little bit later, there's a QR code and a survey, which we'd really like you to do as well. So if you would like to communicate further with me or the team, you can go via the social media link that you'll see on there. And this is a little video of some bee bots. And we're all nerding out over this a couple of days ago. It's just the best thing ever. I would like to hand over to the Bendigo Tech School team just to wrap up and get you ready for your next session. But my name's David Huxley, and I thank you very, very much for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thanks, David. On behalf of the Bendigo Tech School, I would like to thank the Taste of Tomorrow team for joining us today. It has been a wonderful and an engaging session. You all have such a diverse range of knowledge and expertise, and I'm sure all of our attendees have learnt something new through today's session. Also, thank you to those who registered to watch this session. We have 3 more sessions left in our Engaging All Ages in STEAM Day, so hopefully we can see you again shortly. So once this session ends, it will take you to a survey automatically. So it would be so wonderful if you could spend some time filling out the survey, as it helps out the Taste of Tomorrow team to shape future events for them. So that will automatically pop up once this session ends. So thanks everyone again.